He approached an abandoned gas station where a black sheepdog lived that no one could tame. He decided to check why it was guarding this place. What he saw in the doghouse changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The sun over the Colorado desert had a way of flattening everything it touched. Colors lost their depth, shadows turned sharp as knife edges, and the distant mesas shimmered like wavering illusions. Heat rose off the cracked asphalt in trembling curtains, as if the road itself were trying to lift away from the earth. On that lonely stretch of highway, far beyond any town line and miles from the nearest ranch, stood the remains of the old Red Mesa fuel station. For decades, it had been nothing more than a forgotten marker on maps, a relic left behind by travelers who found faster routes and bigger towns. Its paint had long peeled away. Its wooden supports leaned inward, as though tired of holding themselves up, and the faded, open 24/7 sign still clung to the window of the gutted cafe, despite not having seen electricity in almost 15 years. But even in its collapse, the station carried a strange kind of gravity. Something in the air made people slow down when they drove past, even if they would never admit it aloud. Perhaps it was the odd stillness of the place, the sense that it watched the road the way a person might, expectant, patient, as though waiting for someone to return. Perhaps it was the way the surrounding desert refused to reclaim the ground, as if the land itself hesitated, uncertain of what the ruins were meant to hold. And then, of course, there was the dog. A black German shepherd appeared at the station one night during late spring, and since then, no one had been able to approach the place without hearing him first. His voice, deep, guttural, and edged with warning, echoed through the stillness whenever a human came too close. Travelers who stopped for photographs or out of morbid curiosity found themselves driven away by the flash of his sharp amber eyes and the sudden thunder of paws pounding the dirt. He struck fear the way lightning struck the desert floor, swift, violent, and impossible to ignore. He wasn't a ghost, though some liked to pretend he was. He was flesh and muscle, scarred and hardened by a life no one in the nearby town of Sanduna could guess. He carried the marks of battles he hadn't chosen, a long scar across his chest that cut through his black fur, a torn ear that stood crooked, and a slight hitch in his step that became more visible at dusk when the desert cooled and old wounds tightened. But nothing about him was weak. His posture carried a soldier's alertness, the readiness of an animal trained to react before thinking. He guarded the station with a ferocity that made even grown men uneasy. His name, though no one yet knew, it was Raiden. People saw only the rough outline of him, the silhouette pacing along the chain-link fence behind the old station, the shadow slipping between rusting gas pumps at night, the flash of fangs when teenagers tested their courage by creeping too close. But they didn't see the feverish way he pressed his nose against the rusted steel of the abandoned security booth, or the way he circled the same cracked patch of pavement again and again, as though tracing the memory of someone who had once stood there. They didn't see the way he lay flat with his ears pulled back whenever thunder rolled in from the distant mountains, trembling so hard the metal of the booth shuddered beneath him. They didn't see how the sight of a passing military truck made him freeze and then retreat behind the shattered window with a kind of silent, helpless dread. He wasn't guarding the station out of rage. He was guarding loss. No one understood that. No one except the man who would soon drive by. For now, though, Raiden belonged only to the silence and to the ghosts the desert carried. In the nearest town, people spoke of him often. The bartender at El Coyote claimed he'd seen Raiden attack a metal dumpster with such intensity that he dented it. A pair of tourists swore the dog chased their RV for a full mile before turning back, panting but unrelenting. Old Mr. Vasquez insisted the dog was the reincarnation of a legendary Apache spirit meant to protect the desert. Teenagers traded rumors about secret government experiments, but no one could explain why Raiden always returned to the station, why he scratched at the security booth door every night until his paws bled, or why he raised his head toward the sky as though listening for a command long abandoned. Every few days someone would stop on the highway, stepping out with a camera or a half-hearted bag of kibble. They all retreated quickly. Raiden tolerated no strangers. He tolerated no approaches, no attempts to coax him out of the booth, no lingering glances. The station was his territory, and nothing alive could cross it. But everything changed the day a dusty old pickup rolled across the asphalt, its engine rumbling like a tired animal. Behind the wheel sat a man who hadn't seen this highway in 14 years. His name was Ethan Cross, and he had not planned to stop. He hadn't planned to see anyone or anything. He had returned only because his father had died and left behind a box of documents no one else could claim. Ethan had spent over a decade living in isolation in a small cabin in the northern forests of Colorado, a place where snow muffled the world and kept memories at bay. He had chosen silence deliberately, the way others chose company. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't remind him of the sand of Afghanistan or the metallic scent of blood on fur. Silence didn't conjure the image of a muscular German shepherd racing forward toward a blast that Ethan should have seen coming. But the desert wasn't silent. Not today. The moment Ethan's truck neared the station, he felt a pull, subtle at first, then tightening like an old ache flaring in his bones. His hands reflexively tightened on the steering wheel. He told himself he had no reason to look, no reason to slow, no reason to turn his head. Then he heard the sound. It was not a bark. It was too raw, too desperate. It was the sound of metal being struck again and again, of claws tearing at steel with a fervor fueled by panic. It was a sound Ethan knew far too well, the sound of a dog reacting to fear so deep it had carved itself into instinct. He pressed his foot on the brake. The truck slowed. His breath did too. There, at the far end of the old fuel pumps, he saw a figure hurtling against the door of the security booth. A black shape, full of explosive energy. A dog? No. A large dog leaping, slamming, snarling, but not at a human. Not at a threat. He wasn't trying to attack. He was trying to get out, maybe to protect something, maybe to warn someone. The booth rattled with every blow, and beside it, armed with a tranquilizer rifle and a face tight with frustration, stood Garrett Lee, the county animal control officer whose patience with the creature had run thin. Ethan should have driven away, but something in that frantic rhythm of paws against steel reached into him like a hand, dragging up a memory he had buried deep beneath layers of guilt. The movement of the dog's head, the way he jerked upward toward the sky between impacts, it struck Ethan like a blow. He had seen that motion before, not from this animal, but from another. A tan German shepherd named Bosco, whose ears would prick, whose gaze would lift, whose muscles would tighten a split second before the ground erupted beneath them. Ethan's stomach dropped. He stopped the truck completely. Garrett noticed him. He shouted something, waving one arm while struggling to keep the rifle in the other. His words were lost in the clamor, but the meaning was clear. Turn around. Leave. Don't get involved. Ethan didn't move. Something old inside him had woken. Something he thought he'd locked away forever. The dog slammed its body again. A hinge bent. A metallic screech split the air. Garrett cursed and lifted the rifle. Ethan opened his truck door. He didn't fully understand why. It wasn't duty. He had abandoned that long ago. It wasn't courage. He'd spent years running from the truth of who he had once been. It wasn't responsibility. This wasn't his dog, his town, his problem. It was recognition. The kind that hits a man in the chest. The kind that tells him he knows what he's seeing, long before the mind can shape the words. He stepped onto the cracked asphalt, the heat rising through the soles of his boots. Garrett swore again and aimed the rifle higher. The dog turned sharply as he sensed Ethan's presence, muscles bristling, tail stiff, a growl rippling from his throat like an engine revving. Ethan raised both hands slowly, showing empty palms. His heart pounded like a drum. The dog didn't back down, but he didn't lunge either. Instead, he stared deep into Ethan's eyes, breathing hard, chest heaving. Ethan saw fear there, but not born of aggression. It was a fear sharpened by memory, by training, by trauma. It was a soldier's fear. Ethan lowered his hands at the same moment Garrett began shouting at him to move aside. Yet Ethan didn't hear Garrett's words. He heard only the dog, the scraping of claws, the breath caught between growl and plea, the faint trembling sound of an animal struggling not against a man, but against the invisible hands of the past. The dog's gaze flickered upward again, toward the empty sky. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew that look. He had lived with it. He felt it now as fresh as the moment a blast wave had thrown him onto the ground, half a world away. He whispered to no one. He's not aggressive. He's afraid. Garrett shouted louder, panic creeping into his voice. "Back up, Cross! I said back up! He's dangerous! He nearly tore my arm open last time!" But Ethan stepped further from the truck, his movements steady, deliberate. Each step was a negotiation with his own heartbeat, with memories clawing to the surface. He couldn't explain the logic even to himself. He only knew he couldn't let the rifle fire. Not yet. Not when something in this dog's trembling stance mirrored the very thing Ethan had spent 14 years trying to forget. He reached the old cafe patio, where a rusted metal chair lay toppled. He picked it up slowly, as though lifting something fragile, then carried it toward the booth. Garrett swore again, threatening to tranquilize them both if Ethan didn't move. But Ethan stayed silent. He placed the chair about 10 meters from the booth, exactly the distance he once used with Bosco during training, and took a seat without a word. Raiden snarled at the gesture, as if daring him to try any closer. His chest rose and fell with rapid bursts of breath, but his eyes stayed locked on Ethan, never leaving him, not even to glance at Garrett. It was a beginning, a dangerous one, but a beginning nonetheless. Garrett lowered the rifle slightly, thrown off by the simple absurdity of Ethan sitting in the heat, staring calmly at a dog that had nearly destroyed a steel door. "You're insane," Garrett muttered. "Completely insane." But Ethan didn't react. He simply watched the dog. Not with dominance, not with challenge, but with the kind of quiet patience that comes from knowing exactly what kind of war is happening inside another creature's mind. Raiden seemed torn between attack and retreat. His paws paced furiously in the tiny space of the booth, scraping the concrete. His eyes flicked to Ethan's face, then to the ground, then back to Ethan again, as though trying to understand the shape of this stranger's intention. Minutes stretched. The sun drifted across the sky. Sweat rolled down Ethan's neck. The air vibrated with heat. Eventually, the shepherd stopped pacing. He sank slowly to the floor of the booth, legs folding beneath him, as if exhaustion had finally caught up. His breathing remained fast, but less frantic. His ears twitched toward Ethan. The growling faded to a low, uncertain rumble. And Ethan, for the first time in 14 years, felt his own breath begin to steady. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was the first moment neither of them was running. What Ethan did not yet know was that this fragile thread between them would soon be the only thing capable of saving the dog. And perhaps, in ways he could not foresee, the only thing capable of saving Ethan himself. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the dying station. And somewhere in the distance, a storm was gathering. a quiet growl of thunder foreshadowing the days that lay ahead. The first day had started. 6 remained. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cross stayed exactly where he was, because he finally understood. The past he had tried to bury was sitting 10 meters away behind a rusted metal door, staring back at him with amber eyes. Their stories were about to collide. The storm that had murmured on the horizon at the end of the first day rolled in after midnight, breaking the desert open with sharp cracks of thunder that rattled the loose metal sheets of the abandoned roof. Ethan slept fitfully in the rundown motel 20 miles away, and each distant rumble threaded itself into his sleep like a warning he had heard before. He woke twice, breathing hard, the ghost of sand and fire lingering in his mind. But it wasn't the memories of Afghanistan that finally pulled him from bed. It was the thought of the dog behind the steel booth door, alone, trembling, surrounded by the kind of thunder that didn't merely frighten him, but triggered wounds carved deep into his nervous system. When he returned to the station the following morning, the sun had barely risen, but the heat already lay heavy in the air. The storm clouds lingered low on the mesa, their edges still dark, and the ground was scattered with broken twigs and windblown debris. Garrett's truck was parked beside the pumps, and the officer himself leaned against the hood, with a scowl carved deep into his face. He held a folder thick with papers, too thick for it to be good news, and every few moments he tapped the edge of it against his thigh with impatience. When Ethan stepped out of his truck, Garrett didn't bother with greetings. "They signed the order," he said, shaking the folder slightly for emphasis. "If the dog's not under control by Monday, he's done. No extensions, no debates." Ethan met his stare, but said nothing. His focus had shifted to the booth, where Raiden lay pressed into the farthest corner, chest rising and falling with the frayed breath of an animal who hadn't slept. The metal frame bore new dents, and dried blood streaked the inside of the door. One of the hinges hung crooked. Ethan swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. "He didn't attack anyone in the night," Garrett added defensively, as though trying to soften the truth. "Storm caused him to panic. I heard it from town. Sounded like the whole desert was cracking in half. Dog like him. Noise like that could set off a bomb in his brain." The phrasing was careless but unintentionally accurate. Ethan stepped closer to the booth. Raiden didn't lift his head, but one amber eye flickered open, watching him with the exhausted caution of a soldier waking from a nightmare. Ethan caught his breath. The dog's chest shivered. His paws trembled. That wasn't aggression. That was the aftermath of terror so profound, it left the body trembling long after the cause had passed. "He remembers something," Ethan murmured under his breath. Garrett scoffed. "He remembers biting people." But Ethan already knew better. He retrieved the chair from where he had left it the previous day and settled into it again, this time only 8 meters from the booth. His movements were slow, deliberate, a silent promise that nothing about this moment would be unpredictable. Raiden watched him through half-lidded eyes, muscles twitching each time a stray boom of thunder sounded in the distance. Ethan stayed for nearly an hour. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't impose. He let the dog exist in his presence without pressure, letting trust form the way roots push into dry earth. Slowly, persistently, in ways invisible at first, but undeniable over time. Raiden's rigid body loosened gradually, his breathing softening to something resembling rest. Only then did Ethan rise from the chair, retrieve a small container of food from his truck, and set it down beside the booth door before taking several steps back. Raiden stared at the container for a long while. His nostrils flared slightly, his pupils expanded. But he made no attempt to move toward it until Ethan had retreated all the way to the chair and sat again. When he did stand, it was with the stiffness of an animal who had spent the night in a state of hyper-vigilant panic. His legs wobbled under him, but he reached the container, sniffed deeply, and only after ensuring Ethan hadn't moved even a breath closer did he begin to eat. It wasn't victory. It was the second day. The following morning, Ethan approached again. The desert was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles heavily after a storm. Raiden was awake, sitting near the door of the booth, and though his posture remained tense, there was something different in his expression. Something sharp and hesitant, like recognition nudging the edge of awareness. Ethan crouched a few meters away and placed his hand on the booth's wire mesh window. It was a bold move, but he executed it with the care of someone who knew that a single sudden motion could reset days of fragile progress. Raiden edged forward, step by careful step, his body low to the ground. His nose twitched. The rhythm of his breaths shifted. When he reached the mesh, he paused, his muzzle inches from Ethan's fingers, as though drawn by an instinct older than fear. Then he leaned forward just enough to breathe in Ethan's scent. A small moment, invisible to anyone else, but enormous in its implications. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Good," he whispered. The word was barely sound at all. Garrett, who had been leaning against his truck with crossed arms, muttered, "You're wasting time." But Ethan had heard the precise tone of Raiden's exhale, the soft, human-like sigh that military dogs sometimes made when their bodies recognized familiarity even before their minds accepted it. It wasn't submission. It was memory stirring. On the third day, Ethan returned with words he hadn't used in years. They felt foreign on his tongue at first, like syllables borrowed from another lifetime. The desert wind carried them softly, and Raiden's ears pricked at the sound. "Sits." The shepherd stiffened. His eyes narrowed slightly before flickering with something like confusion. Ethan waited, letting the words settle into the air like dust. After a few long seconds, Raiden shifted his weight, lowering his back legs. It wasn't obedience, not fully. It was exhaustion guiding his muscles into a natural fold. But the motion aligned so precisely with the command that Ethan felt a rush of something he'd forgotten how to name. On the fourth day, Ethan brought something harder, a battered navy blue muzzle he had borrowed from Laura, the local veterinarian. He did not attempt to put it on Raiden. Instead, he placed it on the ground several feet from the booth and sat again in his chair. Raiden sniffed the air suspiciously the moment he caught its scent, a deep, instinctive tension rippling through his shoulders. Military dogs knew the meaning of such gear. They knew what came before it and what came after. Ethan didn't touch it. He didn't coax the dog toward it. He simply waited. Raiden approached it slowly, circling twice before lowering his muzzle toward it. He sniffed, backed away, approached again, lay down beside it for several long seconds, then rose and retreated to the booth. It was the longest he had spent outside the booth since Ethan had first arrived. Garrett watched all of this from a distance, with an expression that wavered between irritation and reluctant awe. On the fifth day, the sky turned dark in the late afternoon. The storm returned without warning, slamming into the desert with a ferocity the locals hadn't expected. Thunder cracked across the mesa, rolling over the ground in heavy waves. Lightning forked through the sky, illuminating Raiden's booth in stark, jarring flashes. The shepherd's reaction was immediate and devastating. Terror swept through him in a violent surge that erased all progress. His body crashed against the booth walls. His claws shredded the metal. He howled, not in anger, but in raw panic, slamming himself against the side panel until it bent outward. Ethan sprinted toward the booth, just as Raiden tore through the compromised panel, scattering shards of metal across the ground. Garrett shouted for Ethan to stop, but Ethan ignored him. Raiden bolted into the desert, tail low, ears pinned, his body a blur of fear disappearing through sheets of driving rain. Garrett cursed violently and swung his rifle into position. "That's it! That's enough! That dog is a danger. He could kill somebody in this state!" Ethan grabbed the rifle barrel, forcing it downward. Garrett spun toward him with furious disbelief, water dripping from his hat brim. "You don't get it," Ethan said, voice hoarse. "You shoot him now, and you're killing a memory. You're killing a soldier." "What I'm killing," Garrett snapped, "is a threat to the public." "He's not a threat. He's wounded." Garrett shook his head and stalked toward his truck. "I'm done arguing. If he shows up near town, he's finished." The storm raged deep into the night, and by morning, Garrett's anger had hardened into official action. He gathered 2 locals with tranquilizer rifles and set out on the trail of the dog. Ethan arrived at the station minutes after they left. The booth door hung broken. The muzzle lay half buried in the mud. The ground bore the clear signs of frantic movement, deep claw marks, scattered debris, a streak of blood leading away from the station and toward the rising hills. Raiden had fled toward the old mining grounds. Ethan felt the world hold its breath around him. He knew those hills better than almost anyone. And he knew what lay inside them. Narrow tunnels, unstable ledges, pits deep enough to swallow a man whole. If Raiden was heading there in a state of terror, he wasn't just running from the storm. He was running toward his past, and possibly his death. Ethan stood for a moment, rain-soaked dirt clinging to his boots, his hands trembling, not from fear of the desert, but from the knowledge that if he didn't follow, he would lose not only the dog, but a fragile part of himself he had only just begun to touch after years of hiding. He retrieved the supplies he needed, a rope, a flashlight, a first aid kit, tools he had not assembled together in years, since the days when he had moved through landscapes where danger hid beneath every step. He hesitated only once, just long enough for the memory of Bosco's final moments to glance across his vision like a knife scraping a bone. Then he started walking. The desert stretched before him, washed in the pale light of morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Raiden's trail wound through scrub and dust, each paw print filled with rainwater that glistened like tiny mirrors. Ethan followed them, his pace steady, his breath deep, his resolve hardening with every step. Behind him, the broken station lay silent. Ahead, the hills waited, their shadows opening like mouths. And somewhere within them, a dog with a torn ear and a soldier's heart limped through darkness, drawn by memories no one else understood. Ethan pressed forward. The 6th day had begun. The trail into the hills rose steadily, weaving through the low desert brush and clusters of jagged stone that jutted from the earth like old bones. Ethan moved carefully, scanning the ground for tracks, while the morning sun crept higher, pulling the last of the storm clouds apart. The air smelled of wet dust, the metallic scent of old rain lingering like a memory, and every so often he paused to listen to the distant scrape of shifting rock, to the mournful whistle of the wind through the fissures, and to the echoing silence that followed each breath. He was searching not just for signs of Raiden's passage, but for signs of collapse, of panic, of the kind of blind fleeing that had defined the dog's entire last night. The trail told its own fragile story. The paw prints were scattered and uneven, sometimes close together, as if Raiden had limped, sometimes far apart and deep, pressed violently into the earth during bouts of terrified sprinting. Twice Ethan found smears of mud darkened by thin streaks of blood, and each time he slowed, kneeling to examine them with a trembling hand. The wounds had reopened in the storm, he knew, and the pain would have driven the dog deeper into instinct, further from rational thought, further from any chance of stopping to rest. He continued upward. The distant rock formations of the Sonora mining grounds eventually revealed themselves at the crest of the ridge-rusted scaffolding, broken conveyor arms, and the old loading platforms looming against the pale sky like relics from a war. Even from a distance, the place had a haunted look, its shadows too still, its angles too sharp, as though the land itself remembered every injury it had swallowed. Ethan remembered this place well. He had explored parts of it in the early days after returning from overseas, searching for something to occupy the emptiness inside him. The tunnels had always unsettled him, their dark mouths opening into rooms filled with forgotten echoes. That was exactly why a terrified dog would seek them now. They were enclosed, hidden, away from threats on all sides. He quickened his pace. When he reached the main clearing, the silence was different. He could feel it, tightened, pressurized, like a held breath. He scanned the ground and saw the disturbed gravel, the skid marks of paws, the spray of pebbles where Raiden had likely slipped. And then he saw the fissure, a narrow, deep split in the earth, near the central shaft, where a collapsed entrance had created a jagged pit, descending into unforgiving darkness. Ethan's heart lurched painfully. He approached the edge, stepping lightly, mindful of loose stone. The shadows inside the ravine were long and cold, hiding most of the depth from sight, and for a moment he feared the worst, that Raiden had fallen and broken something vital, that he might already be lying at the bottom without breath or movement. Then he heard it, a low, trembling growl rising from below, echoing against the rock. Not a threat, not a challenge, a warning born of terror, exhaustion, and pain. Ethan exhaled shakily. Raiden was alive. He leaned forward carefully, gripping a stable, protruding rock with one hand. The ravine gradually revealed itself. Steep walls of irregular stone, pockets of loose gravel along the edges, and at the bottom, tangled between old rebar and chunks of collapsed roofing material, lay the black shape of the shepherd. Raiden's fur was wet and matted, his right hind leg twisted beneath a metal bar, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark as he stared up at Ethan, lips peeled back in a weak, defensive snarl. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, though he knew Raiden didn't trust the words yet. "You're not alone. I'm here." The dog barked once, a hoarse, panicked sound, the kind he had used in the booth on the first day when desperation outweighed reason. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the sound of a cornered soldier trying to warn everyone away before the world collapsed even further. He looked around quickly, searching for a safe route down. To jump was impossible. The drop was too steep, too unpredictable, and Raiden needed him functional, not broken. But to the side, near a cluster of boulders, the earth sloped downward, forming a treacherous incline of loose shale. It wasn't safe, but it was the only path. Ethan breathed slowly, centering himself in a way he hadn't done since Afghanistan. He tugged his gloves tighter, adjusted the rope coiled around his shoulder, and began to descend the slope. The gravel shifted under every step. Dust slid down with him in small avalanches. His boots scraped against the unstable rock, and once he slipped, landing hard on one knee. But he continued carefully, methodically, matching his breath to his movements. Raiden watched him the entire time, growling softly, though the sound lacked strength. When Ethan finally reached the ledge just above the dog, he stopped, leaning a shoulder against the rock wall, allowing Raiden to see that he meant no sudden harm. The dog trembled violently, panting through clenched teeth, unable to understand why this man had followed him into the depths. Ethan eased himself down slowly, landing on the ravine floor with a quiet thud. Raiden flinched instantly, pulling himself backward, only to cry out in pain as the movement twisted his trapped leg. Ethan winced at the sound. "I know," he whispered. "I know it hurts." The air was cold and still at the bottom of the ravine, and dust hung in thin beams of sunlight filtering through cracks above. Ethan crouched several feet away, not reaching out, not crowding the dog. He watched the rise and fall of Raiden's chest, the rigid tension in the shepherd's shoulders, the way his nostrils flared as he tried to interpret Ethan's presence. Raiden wasn't attacking. He was terrified. Ethan knew the difference well. He had seen it in humans, too, in soldiers pushed past their limits, where fear and pain blended into something that looked like aggression, but was only a desperate attempt to control the chaos. Slowly, Ethan removed his gloves and placed them beside him. His hands were visible, steady, open. His voice was gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to get you out." The dog shifted, eyes narrowing, but he didn't bare his teeth this time. Instead, he emitted a low, broken whine that scraped through Ethan's chest like a blade. "It's okay," Ethan repeated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of dried beef, setting it lightly on the ground between them. Raiden didn't move. His gaze flickered to the offering, and then back to Ethan, uncertain, afraid to make the first move. Ethan didn't push. He knew trust was a fragile thing, especially for a creature who had been betrayed before, whose last memories of confinement and thunder and violence had carved scars no storm could wash clean. After several long minutes, Ethan shifted his weight and spoke again, not in English this time, but in quiet, measured German, the language he hadn't used since the days he had trained dogs like Bosco. "Sitz. Nein, Angst. Ich bin hier." The effect was immediate. Raiden's ears twitched, his gaze sharpened. Confusion flickered through his expression, like a spark fighting against the wind. Ethan continued. "You know this. Somewhere inside you, you know this. Soldier to soldier." Raiden's body shuddered. His growl tapered into a soft whimper. His muscles loosened, just slightly. It was enough. Ethan edged forward inch by inch, moving so slowly that even the dust beneath him seemed hesitant to stir. When he reached the twisted rebar trapping Raiden's leg, he paused. The dog let out a sharp warning, chest tightening as he anticipated pain. "I won't move it yet," Ethan murmured. "Just looking." He examined the metal bar and the rock pinning the leg in place. It was lodged deeply, but not beyond hope. If he could lift the chunk of stone and shift the rebar just a few inches, Raiden could free his leg himself without a brutal yank. He removed his belt and formed a loop, creating a makeshift slip lead. Raiden stiffened, recognizing the shape, the meaning, the memory tied to it. But he didn't lunge or snap. Instead, he watched Ethan with wide, uncertain eyes, trembling but still. "You'll need this to climb," Ethan said softly. "I'm not tying you, just helping you stand." He leaned forward and slid the loop slowly over Raiden's neck. The dog tensed, but he allowed it, the slight shift in his breathing the only sign of resistance. Ethan tightened it just enough to give them a connection. Then he placed one hand on the rock. "Ready?" Raiden whined, shifting his weight. Ethan pushed. The rock moved an inch, then two. The metal groaned. Dust fell in thin sheets. Ethan strained, muscles burning, pushing again until finally the bar shifted enough for the leg to slide free. Raiden yelped as the pain spiked, but he didn't thrash. He didn't bite. He lifted his leg instinctively, holding it close to his body, trembling violently. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. Good. Very good. Now came the hard part. The climb. The ravine slope looked even steeper from below. Ethan tested the rope, then slipped the loop end under Raiden's chest to support his weight without pulling on the injured leg. He braced himself and tugged gently. "Up," he said softly. We go together. Raiden hesitated only briefly before leaning into the pull. The first few steps were agony. His nails scraped the rock. His breathing came in ragged bursts. Ethan climbed alongside him, one foot digging into the shale, one hand gripping the rope, the other extended toward the dog for balance. They climbed together, slipping, sliding, clawing upward through dust and broken stone. Twice Raiden's back leg buckled, and each time Ethan caught him with the rope, steadying him, murmuring soft commands. Up, waiter, steady. At last, with a final heave, Ethan reached the ledge near the top and pulled Raiden up beside him. The dog collapsed onto the flat ground, panting, shaking, but alive. Ethan sank beside him, gasping, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. For a long time, neither moved. The desert stretched silent around them, vast and empty. Ethan watched Raiden lift his head weakly and rest it against his leg, a gesture so small and yet so filled with trust that Ethan felt something in his chest crack and settle in a new place. "Good boy," he whispered, resting a hand gently on the dog's neck. Raiden closed his eyes. When they emerged from the rocky trail into the desert clearing where Garrett and the others waited, the scene froze. Meredith gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Jared stepped forward, shoulders dropping in visible relief. The two younger officers stared wide-eyed at the dog walking limping, leaning heavily on Ethan, but walking without a leash pulling him tight. Garrett was the last to react. His rifle lowered slowly as he stared at Raiden's battered form. His stance was unsteady, fear and shame warring behind his eyes. Then, without a word, he turned, walked to his truck, and returned with a professional medical kit. He set it on the ground between them. "That leg needs care," he said quietly, voice stripped of bluster. "And I have the equipment." He didn't wait for praise. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stepped back. Jared nodded once, understanding the weight of the gesture. "Transport is ready," he said. "Let's get him to the clinic." Ethan helped guide Raiden into the carrier. The dog trembled but didn't fight, his gaze fixed on Ethan the entire time, as though the man's presence alone was enough to keep the rising panic at bay. As the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Ethan felt a strange stillness settle over him. Not the empty kind that had defined his years of isolation, but the charged, expectant quiet of a life about to change. Jared approached him. "You saved him," he said simply, "and you saved us from making the wrong choice." Ethan looked toward the fading dust trail of the transport vehicle. "No," he said. "We saved each other." Weeks later, winter brushed the desert with its first breath. A thin frost sparkled across the scrub near the shelter's new fenced rehabilitation area. Inside the yard, Raiden, stronger now, his leg healing, lay basking in the morning sun, chewing lazily on a thick rope toy Meredith had brought him. Ethan stood nearby, watching with quiet satisfaction as a new veteran, younger and unsteady, took a seat beside a trembling rescue hound. He coached him gently, his voice calm and patient. Meredith emerged from the clinic with a clipboard, smiling. Jared repaired a fence post nearby, whistling under his breath. Even Garrett passed by sometimes, no longer avoiding the yard. Raiden lifted his head and trotted, still slightly stiff, to press against Ethan's leg. Ethan rested a hand on his back. "Ready for another day, soldier?" he asked. Raiden's tail thumped once. The desert, once a place of endings, now felt like the beginning of something neither man nor dog had expected, a home forged not from running, but from returning. And for the first time in 15 years, Ethan Hayes felt whole. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Watch the other videos on the channel. They continue the journey. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it.